Mr. Klein and I are going to kind of talk to you guys about project-based learning and how that can support success skills, both for facilitators and supporters. This is me. I'm Chantel Collins. I teach 6th and 7th grade ELA at the Academy at Shawnee Middle School. Been teaching for 12 years and I'm actually currently pursuing my PBL certification through Magnify Learning cohort, which has been amazing.
And then I'm Noah Klein. I'm the AIC at Shawnee. This is also my 12th year in education. I spent 2 years at Stewart Academy being an instructional coach, and I was a teacher both at Shawnee and at Iroquois High School before becoming the AIC at Shawnee. And then I am actually a certified PBL facilitator from the same program that Collins is currently doing her work. So we do want to acknowledge real quick that this is short, and Ms. Collins would tell you that I am the type of facilitator where I actually like to talk less and have you do more. And in a half-hour setting, that is not exactly something we can do with ease. So we did want to provide you with some ways to continue the conversation, but also to have these resources on hand. At the end of this presentation, there is going to be a ton of resources at your disposal. So take a second, grab your phone, take a picture of this stuff so you have it for all of eternity so that you can use it whenever you feel the need. For those of you who have not used Bitly's before, I'm sure that is none of you, but capitals do matter. And sometimes that becomes an issue. So I'll give you a second to take a picture of that or write it down, and then we will carry on. And I just saw Shelley Barber's wonderful face smiling at me. Hi, Shelley. All right. So our outcomes for today. Essentially, you're going to notice a pattern and a flow to what Chantel and I do through this session. Essentially, I'm going to be completely honest. When we were asked to do this session, I went to Chantel immediately and I was like, I have no part in doing this because she's about to tell you about an amazing experience that she provided for her kids this year. And so what you're going to basically hear is us going back and forth about her process with the PBL, the outcomes she saw, and then I'll come in on the back end and talk about as a support staff, what that, how we can support each of those phases. So we're saying that you all will experience the planning and implementation process of a real PBL and how it led to meaningful success skill development, and then also strategies and how coaches, peers, and administrators can support meaningful PBL. I know that a lot of people who are kind of sitting in my seat tend to be administrators or AICs, but we do want to make the argument that even regular classroom teachers are an invaluable resource to the PBL planning and implementation. I've done PBL in isolation. It is super hard. So the more people you have thinking about it and providing feedback to the process is beneficial. So I'll turn it over to Collins and she's going to start talking about some idea development. And oh, I meant to say this, and I'm sorry. The way that we structure tonight as well is going to be basically almost the process that you would want to plan a PBL. We are staging it out in the order of events, if you will. So I just wanted to make that clear. So Ms. Collins will talk about idea development.
All right, so the struggle is real, and it really is. So when you're talking about idea development, the first thing you want to do is think about what is going to interest and involve your students. What's the first thing you want to do? What are your students interested in? What's going to get them involved? What is going to make them excited about their learning? And you also want to make sure that whatever the idea is, it revolves around a real world problem, something the students can actually solve, not something that's just for your classroom, but something that matters in the world. Then think about the standards you want to teach, which is not something that we usually do. Normally you think about what standards do I have to teach? How am I going to teach the standards? For this process, you really want to come up with your idea first and then work your standards in. And I promise you're going to be able to do it. It sounds crazy, but it works. And having that idea that the students are going to be interested and involved in first, and then incorporating your standards is going to matter more to the students. And then think about what the final product should or needs to be. After you have got the idea, then you work in your standards, then, okay, what's my final product going to be? So what's going to interest the kids? What real world situation problem can we solve? What product can they create for that to solve that problem or situation, and work the standards in as we go, which sounds like a very weird process, but it works.
And I do really want to reinforce something she just said, because sometimes these might get flipped around one or two bullets at a time. But I was privy to Chantel's planning process to the project she's going to present here in a little bit. And what was super cool was that she knew what she wanted the kids to do at the end. She had this fabulous idea. She had this, like, what will the final product be? And then she went, okay, what standards fit? She has the luxury of being an English teacher. As an English teacher myself, like, our standards go everywhere. It doesn't really matter. We can make anything do anything. But we do want to make the argument that it doesn't matter what you teach. If you approach the standards last, I promise you can find something that fits, unless it is just so off the wall, in which case that's a whole other conversation. Chantel, I think I cut you off. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. That's absolutely right. Unless your idea is just very off the wall and crazy, you're going to find a way to make the standards work to fit the idea. And I did come up with my final product first, but whether you come up with the final product that you want or your idea, whatever it is, just needs to be of high interest to students, because that's going to make the learning more engaging for them and more fun. And I promise my students talked about how fun the project was. And then we're like, oh, I learned this after the fact, which is super cool. And definitely made for a better learning experience for them. So Klein, I'm gonna kind of pass it off to you.
So supporting idea development as a coach is really difficult because it is so engaging and so much fun when we as coaches and supporters aren't careful and we're not really metacognating around our own involvement. We tend to then take over. I know that I've worked with teachers in the past who are implementing PBL that I was so excited about that I started giving all the ideas. And I had one teacher check me once. I'm very thankful for it. But I needed that moment to remember that the process is important for you to support, but the PBL is not yours. As engaging as the PBL is for kids, when it's done well, it's just as engaging for teachers. It makes teaching more fun. And so we want to really make sure they own the process, and we want to step back. Get really comfortable with question asking, whether that's through a framework like cognitive coaching, whether you use the school reform initiatives, probing and clarifying question sheet, whether it's your own little tip or trick of the trade. Start relying on questions because it does support us stepping back, but also looking at protocols. The more you can structure those moments of idea development, the less you are involved and you put the onus onto the teacher to really drive their own learning. And then listen with intentionality. And really, this just circles back to bullet number one. When you're thinking about your own ideas, you're not listening, right? So we want to make sure that we are intentionally really making sure that we listen and provide timely feedback. Go ahead, Collins.
All right, so the planning process. Everybody kind of has their own process for planning, and we always talk about backward design. And if you have your end product and you know what you want to do, then definitely that's what you're going to do. Look at your end product, work backwards. Fit your standards in however you can. Make sure whatever it is, it's real world. What I have found works best for my students, if they realize that they are going to present their project, their idea, their presentation, whatever it is, to people who are not just me, they get more involved. It becomes more real. Oh, I'm going to have to present this to these other teachers or these other adults or the community partners that we have working with us, and they get more involved in it and it becomes more real. It's not just a classroom assignment anymore. It's a legitimate project to them. And they definitely take more ownership of it. So working backwards definitely works if you have your end product. If you haven't decided on your end product, but you have this great idea, work in the standards, work in your benchmarks, get to your end product, and then go backwards and make sure that you've included everything. One of the hardest things for me is always the benchmarks. I usually have a great idea. I usually have an end product, and then I have to go back and go, okay, where do I put the benchmarks in? But when you start with that great idea and then you figure out your end product, it will all fall into place, especially when you decide what standards are going to work. So just make sure you have your idea, you have your end product, it's somehow meshed into the real world so that the students definitely take ownership of it and they get way more involved and excited about it. And then add your benchmarks in so that you're assessing the standards, whether they're understanding what's going on, the content that you're teaching, and that they're moving forward in the project process. The cool thing about this process is the students really lead their own learning and you just kind of guide them through. And that's what the benchmarks do. Benchmarks make sure that they're understanding everything as you go along and they're moving forward in the project, but they're really doing their own learning. You're just kind of there facilitating and guiding. I step back a lot when they do their project. So if you plan it well, you just kind of hang out and guide and help when needed, and they run the show. You just need to make sure you've got your benchmarks in place so that you're making sure that they're learning as they go and you let them go with it. Klein?
Well, it's actually still you, but I do want to point out, and I put it in the chat, these pictures are used with intentionality. PBL planning process looks different for different people. I'm the clock. I'm very sequential. I'm going to figure it out as I go. Collins is not. And so, just as a teacher or as somebody supporting a teacher, understand that's okay. And neither is right and neither is wrong. But Collins, it's still you because you were going to introduce your project.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So the project that I had the students do, I sort of came up with the end product first, which led to the idea and then everything else. So I totally planned like the pile of rubber band mess. I had the students create an equitable unit of curriculum for the subject of their choice. In English, I kind of have that capability where I can teach them whatever the standards are. They can choose their own subject. So they created an equitable unit of curriculum. They created their own unit. They created their assessments, assignments, activities, field trips. They did all of it while looking through an equitable lens. So everything they did, they had to make sure it was equitable for all students, all learners, and everybody was getting what they needed. That was my end product. And I started there and worked backwards through everything else. I had some community partners come in. I had some curriculum design people from JCPS come in and talk with the students about designing units and curriculum. I had Rachel Klein from JCPS Equity come in and talk about what it means to be equitable and how to do that so that they had some background to start with. We presented them with the idea. We presented them with the problem. We have an issue with school curriculums not being equitable, and we need to find a way to create more equitable curriculum so that, students will become more invested in their learning. And we put it on them to present this to people at JCPS in the curriculum departments, in the equity departments, in deeper learning. They presented their curriculum. So they knew they would present their project, their unit, to all of these people who had a say in how curriculum was written. So there's your real world. They weren't just giving it to me. It wasn't just a classroom activity. They took this and they presented it at the end. We had a huge presentation at the end. There was something, I think there was as many adults in the room as there were students when we presented it. And they were amazing. They were so excited. They did such an amazing job. They really got invested in this. Their units were wonderful. And we even gave them to the other teachers in the building to kind of use with their class. And the science teacher I know is going to have one of the students with their units kind of teach some lessons. So that got them even more invested and involved when we got the other teachers involved and they were able to take this out into their own classrooms and use them. So my hodgepodge of design, definitely all over the place, but they learned so much about writing informational text, reading informational text, research skills, all of that stuff through this one little project.
And the really cool thing, because I was at their presentations, at the end of it all, I don't remember who asked it, but somebody basically asked, like, what English things did you learn? And the kids, like, crickets. And then that started trickling in. And they were identifying exactly the things that Collins wanted them to be doing. But Collins never said, we're going to learn how to write a persuasive paper today, right? Like, the kids learned it and they could figure it out and they saw it. But what they were doing was engaging with the content in a different context, and that made it transferable. And so I think, yeah, she is vastly underselling the impact of what she did. It was a really, really cool experience. From the coach's lens, when we're supporting the planning process, I'm just going to harp on this again. It doesn't belong to you. And so offering ideas and asking guiding questions is important, because this is where, as the coach, we have to look at possible threats to the system that the teacher is sometimes just unable to see because they are so immersed in it. So it's our job to step back and offer those really critical questions of, like, have you thought about this, or have you thought about that, or what are your assumptions about X, Y, and Z? But again, we want to make sure we are coming from a place of support. And in the vein of support, grease the wheels for teachers. PBL planning, I love teaching PBL. I hate planning PBL because it is a really, really arduous process. It takes a long time. My rule of thumb is basically for every week I plan on teaching a PBL, it's going to take me 3 or 4 weeks to plan it. Now I go above and beyond and I way overanalyze, but it takes a long time. So as much as you as the coach or the supporter can grease some wheels, make some phone calls, give them contacts, seek community partners, get feedback for them, the better that it will come off. Because as coaches, we tend to have that different lens of, we really need to focus on the standards and the assessments and things like that. We really want to support the teachers in making sure that we are supporting them in quality benchmarks that get us good information. Make sure we're supporting them in their just-in-time instruction, helping them see how they can still have aspects of traditional instruction in this context. And then making sure we understand and that they understand scaffolding, which is a huge part of PBL planning. Go ahead, Collins, just to point your attention to the clock, we got 12 minutes.
Yep. Okay. So for the implementation of a PBL, it's very sequential. You introduce the content. I usually do a lot of background with them. Whatever the standards are, I always try to introduce them first, get them exposed to whatever it is we're going to be working on. Then, of course, you have your entry event. It introduces the project in a fun way. You have your community partners come in, and usually I step back during the entry event. I let the community partners kind of run the show because they're my experts in whatever it is that I'm doing. And at the end, I kind of present them with the problem, the project, whatever it is I want them to do. And throughout the project, you have your mini lessons, you have your workshops, but the students run it. You give them little mini lessons as you go, you explain, you show them the rubrics, and then they kind of take off. And it's great when you watch them in their small groups, right now, breakout rooms, and they're like, no, we don't need to, we're fine. And it's great. And you're just like, all right, cool. And you step back and watch them run the show. And that's pretty amazing. So you do your mini lesson and then you let them go with it. You give your benchmarks, you scaffold where you need to. It really depends on their level of knowledge, how comfortable they are in the subject. Sometimes I have to scaffold, sometimes I don't. Sometimes they just run with it and they're good. It's linear. It's not, timelines are always flexible. I will plan a project for so many weeks. And sometimes I finish early and sometimes I run way over, and it's just whatever the students need. And you do have to be really flexible in a project, but I promise you're going to get all of the standards taught. They're going to learn even more than you could possibly imagine. And when they start to take charge and run their own learning, you see some pretty amazing things happening.
And the really cool thing is the PBL setup allows teachers to rest in that place of comfort, the direct instruction, the giving of knowledge. Like, there is still a place for that. It's just far more limited. But now we're also recapitalizing our time. right? The group workshops, etc. Like my lesson plan often was workshop time. And I would go in front of my class and say, what do you need to know today? And I'd write it up on my window because I didn't have a whiteboard. So I used an expo marker on a window. And that was my lesson plan. I attacked what they needed, but also that entry events, things like it, is a place to have fun. You know, she relies on community partners. The very first one I ran, I had seniors in high school eating baby food and then creating arguments about it. It's just like you can get creative. And also if you want to see something really funny, have a bunch of seniors eat baby food. It's the best. From a coach's perspective, understanding design thinking is imperative with PBL. Like Collins was saying, PBL is both linear and cyclical. So we do need to move them through the design thinking process. But I love this version of the design thinking. I love this graphic, this version, because what we see is that we do want to go from understand to explore to materialize. But what we also know is we're going to have to double back on things a lot of the time. If you think back to something that you consider yourself an expert at, I can say with 100% certainty, I would win a lot of money in Vegas that you did not do it linearly. And if you did, you're a genius, and I'm really envious of you. What we know is oftentimes it's a process of 3 steps forward, 4 backwards, 3 forward, 2 backwards. And it's a slow progression over time towards becoming an expert. But we know that we are going to have to double back. But if we can really, as coaches and supporters, keep a laser focus on, we need to think about standards, they don't go away. We need to make sure workshops are happening because that's where teaching happens. We need to make sure benchmarks are happening because that's where we assess for student learning. We do those things, but we support teachers in understanding their own design thinking because they need to reflect on the process and improve over time. But we also need to support the teachers' ability to support students in design thinking because this is unlike anything they've ever done. So showing them that learning is messy is okay. But they need to have processes to set up to really think about that.
All right, so this is one of my favorite parts, the reflection part of the project. Always, always, always have a way for your students to reflect on the project, not only for you, but for them. So I always find out what they liked, what they didn't like, what worked for them, what didn't work. What part of the project they liked the best, what helped them learn the most, what they absolutely hated or what was hard for them, because that will tell me if I need to tweak things for the next time. Because even if I don't do the exact same project, I might do a variation of the project. And I want to know what worked and what didn't for all of my students. And then find out how they would change it. Get their input. Ask them to tell you what they would change if they could change anything. They start reflecting too on their learning. So they're not just helping you figure out what you need to change or do better later, but they are figuring out what they learned and how they learned the best and what really does work best for them. My students were able to tell me what part of their project helped them learn more and what part didn't. They were able to tell me that the project was definitely easier for them to learn things than direct instruction, or a couple of them went, direct instruction is a little easier for me. And they were able to tell me that at the end of the project, which is great. And you can do this in so many ways. You can do, a written reflection, a Google form. You can just have a class conversation where you just talk about it and let them have the day to just talk about the project and what they learned. This connects to success skills because they have to reflect. Students have to reflect on every single artifact they put in their backpack, and they have to be able to reflect on the skill, what they've learned, all of that stuff. So this is not only helping you, it's not only helping them think about what they've learned, but it's helping them become a reflective person, which is something they have to do for their backpack every time they add something into it. So this is super important, and it's my favorite part of the project because I tend to learn more than any other part of the project in this stage.
And really, when I threw this picture on this slide, I did it purposefully. I don't know if you can read it on your end. The notebook says create and destroy. And it is kind of hard sometimes for us as educators to step back and say, look, my kids are going to possibly destroy what I just did. They're going to make me fundamentally rethink and rework all this work I've put in. And that's okay. Because the next time Collins does this project, one, it'll be in person, so that'll be awesome. But two, it's just going to be better. So when we talk also about success skills, we are building in student agency. We're talking about building in student voice. We are making them not just recipients of an education, but rather a co-creator of their educational experience, and that's okay. And as a coach, when we're talking about reflection, this is also my favorite part of the process as both a coach and a teacher. Make sure you are reflecting with the facilitator, taking all the evidence, right? All the artifacts, all the reflections from the kids, put everything on the table, and hone in on the good. Because let's be very clear, PBL is never going to be 100% awesome. As Collins just said, there are going to be some kids who say, I wish you had given me direct instruction. And so the challenge becomes, later down the line, how do we incorporate maybe a little more of it to meet those kids? Or how do we change the way we do scaffolds and workshops so they get a little bit more of that? And Collins has actually done a great job at Shawnee because she realized she had one section of kids who were like, we want to do this on steroids and go all in. And she had another group of kids who this really wasn't a good experience for. And she decided to adapt her instruction. She takes pieces of PBL, she takes the best parts and the best hits, but mirrors it in a way that still gives them choice, autonomy, and voice. And so we really want to make sure that we're doing that. So hone in on the good though, because there's going to be plenty of mess. This is celebratory. Guide teachers on how PBL practices should permeate instruction even when you're not doing PBL. For example, the district has gone all in on the workshop model. So when I tell you my lesson plan was usually entry event, grammar or independent reading, and then I don't know, the reason it was I don't know is because I would say, look, at the end of today or the end of tomorrow, here's what we need to do. What do you need today? That's a PBL practice, even if I wasn't doing PBL. And so we want to make sure that these practices start to permeate all facets of what we do. Co-construct knowledge, don't just offer your observations. We want them to come to that understanding on their own. So again, crafting good questions to help them really understand their own impact. And then for the love of all things holy, publicly celebrate them. PBL is hard. It is hard to do. It is hard to plan. It is hard to work through. It is enriching and exhausting all at the same time. So really celebrating them and the work of their kids. Because the teachers who do PBL are celebrating their kids anyway, and they do need some recognition themselves. So with all of that, I'm going to once again put the link to this presentation in the chat box. There's a ton of stuff here for you. You will notice it is very heavy on Magnify Learning materials. I have gone through PBL Buck Institute training. I have done SREB training. She and I have both done Magnify. To me, Magnify is the most approachable and the most comprehensive. So for the facilitator on the left side, you have tons of resources to help you think through project ideas, project planning. There's a bunch of resources. There's also a connection here to the Stanford University Performance Assessment page. Not truly PBL, but performance assessment when done well is still very beneficial. And from the administrator, coach, peer side, again, there's a lot of Magnify, but also connecting to the School Reform Initiative, which gives a lot of really good protocols and question asking techniques. But I also did try to connect some of the PBL works, which was what was Buck Institute. But as a coach, also try it yourself. Even if you're not in a classroom, you can lead professional development like PBL. You can ask Collins, if I'm in charge of a EPD, I'm running it like PBL. When I got my PBL certification, I had just left the classroom. So my evidence came from the trainings I was providing. So embrace it yourself and try it yourself as well. And that brings us right up to 6 o'clock. All our information's there. I won't speak for Collins, but I geek out on this stuff. So if you ever just want a thought partner, I'm one email away. And I really appreciate your time tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys.